They say there's a time and place for everything. A funeral, for instance, is a time to grieve, to reflect, to hold your loved ones close. It is not, and I cannot stress this enough, a time to enforce HOA regulations. But apparently Karen Holloway didn't get that memo. There I was, standing by my son's grave, trying to keep it together as the casket was being lowered into the ground. My heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest and stomped on. The air was thick with sorrow, the kind of silence that makes even the birds stop chirping out of respect. And just as the pastor bowed his head for a final prayer, she appeared, Karen, clipboard in hand, marching across the cemetery like she was on a mission from God, or at least the HOA board, which in her mind was probably the same thing. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice cutting through the solemn air like nails on a chalkboard. Heads turned. People gasped. My mother-in-law clutched her pearls like Karen had just cursed in church. I didn't recognize her at first. Not because I didn't know who she was. Oh, I knew. But because I couldn't fathom that anyone would have the audacity to interrupt a funeral. Yet there she was, in all her HOA glory. Oversized sunglasses, perfectly pressed khakis, and that signature Karen haircut that screams, "I need to speak to your manager." Only this time, she wasn't asking for a manager. She was coming for me. Karen didn't waste any time making her presence known. She marched right up to me. Yes, me, the grieving father, and tapped me on the shoulder like she was about to ask me to move my car out of her reserved parking spot. "Excuse me," she said in that nasal tone that could make even a saint lose their patience. "We have a problem." I turned slowly, half expecting this to be some sort of bizarre misunderstanding. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper because, funeral. "Yes," Karen said with a tight-lipped smile that could curdle milk. She flipped through her clipboard like she was about to cite me for violating some obscure zoning law. "Your son," she continued, pointing dramatically toward Jordan. My 16-year-old who was sitting quietly on a bench near the edge of the cemetery, "is trespassing." I blinked at her, trying to process what I just heard. "Trespassing?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Karen replied matter-of-factly. "He's on HOA property without authorization." Now let me pause here for a moment and explain something about this so-called trespassing. The cemetery where we were holding the funeral happens to border our neighborhood park, a park managed by our HOA. Jordan had wandered maybe 5 feet into the park area to sit on a bench and collect himself after watching his brother's casket being lowered into the ground. He wasn't vandalizing anything. He wasn't disturbing anyone. He was just sitting there. But apparently, in Karen's world, sitting quietly on an HOA-owned bench is tantamount to breaking and entering. "Ma'am," I said slowly because I wanted to make sure I didn't accidentally yell at this woman in front of my entire grieving family. "We live here." Karen raised an eyebrow so high it practically disappeared into her hairline. "Yes," she said with exaggerated patience, as if explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler. "But he didn't sign in as a guest for park access." I stared at her in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 seconds. My brain was struggling to reconcile two conflicting realities. One where I was burying my son, and one where this woman thought now was an appropriate time to enforce HOA rules. Before I could respond, and trust me, I had some words ready, Karen whipped out her phone and dialed 911. That's right, she called the cops. Let me tell you something about being on the receiving end of an HOA power trip. It's like being pecked to death by an overzealous chicken. You know it's ridiculous. Everyone around you knows it's ridiculous. But somehow you're still stuck dealing with it because that chicken has convinced itself it's saving civilization. The police arrived within minutes because apparently nothing else was happening in town that day. 2 officers stepped out of their cruiser looking equal parts confused and annoyed when they saw Karen waving them down like she'd just uncovered a major crime syndicate operating out of the swing set. "I'd like to report trespassing," Karen announced triumphantly, as if she were presenting evidence in front of the Supreme Court. She gestured toward Jordan with all the flair of someone unveiling a masterpiece at an art gallery. The officers exchanged glances that screamed, "Is this lady serious?" but approached Jordan anyway because protocol is protocol. "Son," one of them said gently as they walked over to him, "can you come here for a second?" Jordan looked at me nervously from across the cemetery, and I gave him a small nod because what else could I do? He stood up slowly and walked over to them while Karen stood off to the side with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she expected them to slap cuffs on him immediately. To their credit, the officers were professional and clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. They asked Jordan where he lived, down the street, why he was sitting there, his brother's funeral, and whether he knew why this woman was making such a fuss. He did not. But rules are rules, or so they claimed, and before I knew it, my son was being escorted into the back of their cruiser. Karen looked positively gleeful as they drove away. "I hope this teaches him some respect for community guidelines," she said with all the self-satisfaction of someone who thinks they've just saved humanity from collapse. I stood there watching her march off into the distance like some HOA Napoleon returning victorious from battle and made myself one simple promise. This wasn't over. The thing about Karen Holloway is that she doesn't just ruin your day. She ruins your week. As I sat in my living room later that evening, staring at the empty chair where Jordan usually plopped down to play video games, I realized something. This wasn't just about my son being hauled off in handcuffs for sitting on a bench. This was about Karen's unchecked reign of terror over the neighborhood. And if no one else was going to do something about it, well, they were about to find out what happens when you mess with a grieving father who also happens to be the Attorney General. But first, I needed to get Jordan home. I called the local precinct, explained the situation, and after a few hours of bureaucratic nonsense, because apparently, trespassing in an HOA park is treated like a felony in Karen's world, Jordan was released. He walked through the front door looking tired and confused but otherwise unharmed. "Dad," he said, dropping his backpack on the floor, "are we seriously going to let her get away with this? Oh, sweet summer child." He didn't know it yet, but Karen had just signed her own metaphorical death warrant. The next morning, I dove headfirst into research. If there's one thing you learn as an attorney, it's that every petty tyrant leaves a paper trail. And Karen? She wasn't just leaving a trail. She was practically throwing breadcrumbs out of her HOA-issued golf cart. I started with the HOA's governing documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, which are basically the Bible for HOA rules. It didn't take long to find my first clue. A clause stating that any fines or penalties issued by the HOA must be preceded by a written warning and an opportunity to appeal. Guess what Karen hadn't done before calling the cops on my son? That's right, no warning, no appeal, just straight to DEFCON 1. But wait, there's more. As I dug deeper into the CC and RS, I found another juicy tidbit. HOA board members are prohibited from using their position for personal gain or vendettas. Now, I couldn't prove it yet, but based on Karen's history of targeting my family, like the time she fined us for having unauthorized holiday decorations because Jordan put up a single string of lights, I had a pretty good feeling this wasn't just about enforcing rules. This was personal. I decided to pay a visit to some of my neighbors to see if they'd had similar run-ins with Karen. The stories they told me were equal parts horrifying and hilarious. One woman said Karen fined her $200 because her mailbox was too shiny. Another man claimed Karen threatened to tow his car because it was parked half an inch over the line in his own driveway. And then there was the elderly couple who received a violation notice for having unauthorized flora in their garden. Turns out it was a potted fern they'd owned for 20 years. By the end of the day, I had enough material to write a novel titled Karen, The HOA Chronicles. But this wasn't just about collecting stories. It was about building a case. And oh boy, was I building one. The next step was gathering hard evidence. I filed a formal request for all HOA meeting minutes from the past 2 years, a right guaranteed to homeowners under state law, and spent an entire weekend combing through them. What I found was both shocking and oddly satisfying. Karen had been making decisions without proper board approval, selectively enforcing rules against certain residents. Guess who topped that list? And even misusing HOA funds to pay for administrative expenses, which turned out to be catered lunches from some fancy Italian restaurant downtown. Armed with this information, I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer, a guy named Frank who specializes in HOA disputes and has the demeanor of someone who thrives on chaos. When I walked into his office and laid out everything I'd found, He leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "David," he said, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning, "this is going to be fun." Frank helped me draft 2 letters. One addressed to the entire HOA board demanding Karen's immediate resignation, and another addressed directly to Karen herself outlining every instance of misconduct we'd uncovered. Both letters were sent via certified mail because nothing says, business, like requiring someone to sign for their humiliation. Now, you'd think that would be enough to make Karen back down. But no, Karen doesn't back down. She doubles down. Instead of resigning gracefully or even acknowledging her wrongdoing, she called an emergency HOA meeting and tried to paint me as some sort of neighborhood anarchist hellbent on destroying the fabric of our community. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well for her. The meeting turned into an absolute circus. Dozens of residents showed up, many of whom had their own grievances with Karen, and things quickly spiraled out of her control. At one point, someone brought up how she'd used HOA funds to install security cameras around her house without board approval. Another person mentioned how she'd been caught sneaking onto someone's property late at night to measure their lawn height with a ruler. By the time it was my turn to speak, Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. I stood up, cleared my throat, and delivered what can only be described as an Oscar-worthy performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, holding up a copy of the CC&Rs like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. "We all moved into this neighborhood because we wanted a sense of community, a place where we could feel safe and respected. But under Karen's leadership, this HOA has become something else entirely, a dictatorship." There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd. "I have here," I continued, gesturing toward a stack of documents on the table in front of me, "evidence of financial misconduct, selective enforcement of rules, and blatant abuse of power by our so-called president." Karen tried to interrupt me at one point, something about how she was just doing her job. But I shut her down with a single sentence. "Karen, your job is not above the law." Mic drop. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Karen's days as HOA president were numbered. A vote was held right then and there to remove her from office. And let me tell you, watching her storm out of that room while muttering something about ungrateful residents was more satisfying than winning any court case. But this wasn't just about getting rid of Karen. It was about sending a message. No matter how much power you think you have as an HOA board member or in life, you're not untouchable. And if you mess with someone long enough, well, sometimes they mess back. You'd think removing Karen as HOA president would be the end of the story, right? Like, the villain is defeated, the credits roll, and everyone lives happily ever after. But no, this is Karen we're talking about. Karen doesn't just fade into the background like a normal person who's been publicly humiliated and voted out of power. Karen doubles down again. And this time, she decided to take legal action against me. That's right, me. The grieving father whose son she had arrested at a funeral. The lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a process server who looked way too chipper for someone delivering such nonsense. I opened the envelope and skimmed through it, my jaw dropping lower with every line. Karen was suing me for defamation of character, claiming that my actions at the HOA meeting had caused her emotional distress and irreparable damage to her reputation. Now, let me pause here for a second. Karen's reputation was already about as damaged as a piñata after a kid's birthday party. She didn't need my help with that. But apparently, in her mind, I was solely responsible for her downfall. Not her years of tyranny, not her misuse of HOA funds, not even her decision to call the cops on a teenager at a funeral. Nope, just me. I read through the lawsuit again, this time out loud to Jordan, who was sitting on the couch eating cereal like this was just another Tuesday in our increasingly ridiculous lives. "She's suing you?" he asked between bites of Lucky Charms. "For what? Telling the truth?" "Exactly," I said, tossing the papers onto the coffee table. "Apparently, telling the truth is now considered defamation." Jordan shook his head and muttered something about Karen needing a hobby. Couldn't have agreed more. But here's the thing about being sued by someone like Karen. It's not just annoying, it's personal. She wasn't just trying to win some petty legal battle. She was trying to intimidate me into backing down. And if there's one thing you don't do to an attorney general with access to an entire legal team and a lot of pent-up anger, it's try to intimidate them. So I called Frank, my lawyer and chaos-loving partner in crime, and told him what was going on. "She's suing you?" he said, laughing so hard I thought he might choke on his coffee. "For defamation? Oh, this is going to be fun." Frank immediately got to work drafting our response. We filed a countersuit for malicious prosecution and abusive process because, spoiler alert, Karen didn't actually have a case. Her lawsuit was less about seeking justice and more about wasting my time and money. Unfortunately for her, I had plenty of both. While Frank handled the legal side of things, I decided to dig even deeper into Karen's past behavior. If she wanted to play dirty, fine, I could play dirty too. And let me tell you, what I found made my previous discoveries look like child's play. First off, there were more financial irregularities in the HOA accounts than I'd initially realized. Turns out Karen had been reimbursing herself for business expenses that included spa treatments, first-class flights, and even a $600 pair of designer sunglasses that she claimed were necessary for outdoor inspections. Outdoor inspections. As if she were some kind of HOA Indiana Jones braving uncharted territory in search of overgrown hedges. Then there were the complaints from former board members, people who had resigned because they couldn't deal with Karen's antics anymore. One guy told me she once tried to fine him $50 for leaving his trash cans out an hour past pickup time, while he was recovering from surgery. Another woman said Karen had threatened to report her dog as a dangerous animal because it barked at Karen during one of her infamous clipboard patrols. By the time our court date rolled around, I had enough dirt on Karen to fill a landfill. And let me tell you, walking into that courtroom felt like stepping onto a battlefield where I knew victory was inevitable. Karen showed up wearing what can only be described as courtroom chic, a beige pantsuit that screamed, "I'm innocent," but did nothing to hide the fact that she looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her lawyer, a guy who looked like he'd been hired off Craigslist, stood next to her looking equally frazzled. On my side, Frank, armed with enough evidence to make even Judge Judy raise an eyebrow. The proceedings began with Karen's lawyer making some half-hearted argument about how my comments at the HOA meeting had caused her emotional distress and ruined her standing in the community. He even brought up how she'd been forced to step down as HOA president because of me, as if that wasn't entirely her own fault. When it was our turn to respond, Frank absolutely demolished their case. He presented document after document showing Karen's history of misconduct. Unauthorized fines, misuse of funds, selective enforcement of rules, you name it. He even played audio recordings from residents who had secretly recorded their interactions with Karen over the years, because apparently dealing with her required evidence-gathering skills worthy of a private investigator. But the piece de resistance came when Frank introduced Exhibit Z, an itemized list of all the personal expenses Karen had charged to the HOA over her tenure as president. When he read out loud that she'd spent $1,200 on executive lunches at a steakhouse 2 towns over, even her lawyer looked embarrassed. By the end of our presentation, it was clear that not only did Karen not have a case against me, she was lucky we weren't pressing criminal charges against her. The judge dismissed her lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile, granted our countersuit for malicious prosecution, and ordered her to pay all legal fees plus damages. As we walked out of the courtroom victorious, Frank turned to me with a grin. "Well," he said, clapping me on the back, "that was satisfying." Satisfying didn't even begin to cover it. Watching Karen storm out of that courtroom muttering under her breath about how unfair life is, that was priceless. By the time we got home that evening, word had already spread around the neighborhood about what had happened in court. People started stopping by our house to congratulate us or share their own stories about dealing with Karen over the years. It felt like a weight had been lifted, not just off my shoulders but off the entire community. And as for Jordan, he finally got his piece back too. No more ridiculous fines or threats from clipboard-wielding tyrants interrupting his life. In hindsight, maybe this whole ordeal was exactly what we needed. Not just as a family but as a neighborhood, to remind us all that sometimes standing up to bullies isn't just worth it, it's necessary. You'd think that after losing a lawsuit, being publicly humiliated, and having to pay damages, Karen would finally take the hint and retreat into obscurity. Maybe take up knitting or bird watching. Something quiet, something far away from other people. But no, Karen wasn't just your average petty tyrant. She was a professional petty tyrant. And like any true professional, she wasn't about to let a little thing like total defeat stop her. About a week after the court ruling, I came home to find a bright yellow envelope taped to my front door. It was from the HOA. Now, considering Karen had been ousted as president and was no longer allowed to hold any official position, I figured this had to be some sort of clerical error. But when I opened it, I realized I'd underestimated her capacity for pettiness. The letter was signed by the acting HOA president, who just so happened to be Karen's best friend, Linda. It informed me that my lawn was in violation of HOA standards due to excessive discoloration, and that I had 14 days to address the issue or face a fine of $500. Let me paint you a picture of my lawn. It was green, freshly mowed, and about as discolored as a golf course. But apparently, in Karen and Linda's eyes, it wasn't up to their ridiculous standards. Jordan walked out onto the porch while I was reading the letter and took one look at my face. "What now?" he asked. "They're coming for the lawn," I said, holding up the letter like it was evidence in a crime drama. Jordan stared at me for a moment before bursting out laughing. "The lawn? Are they serious?" Oh, they were serious. Dead serious. And that's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce some arbitrary rule. She was trying to bait me into another fight. She wanted me to lose my cool, to make a scene, to give her an excuse to paint me as the neighborhood troublemaker again. Well, two could play that game. Instead of responding with anger or even acknowledging the ridiculousness of the situation, I decided to fight back in a way Karen would never see coming, by becoming the most obnoxiously compliant homeowner in HOA history. The next morning, I called up every landscaping company in town and asked for their most elaborate lawn care packages. Within 48 hours, my yard looked like something out of Better Homes and Gardens. We're talking perfectly trimmed hedges, flowers planted in symmetrical patterns, and grass so green it looked photoshopped. I even installed one of those fancy irrigation systems that sprays water in perfect arcs like some kind of suburban fountain show. But I didn't stop there. Oh no, if Karen wanted perfection, I was going to give her perfection. I ordered custom-made garden gnomes, dozens of them, and arranged them in an intricate tableau across my front yard. One gnome was fishing in a tiny pond. Another was reading a book under a miniature tree. There was even a gnome wedding happening near the mailbox. By the time I was done, my yard wasn't just compliant with HOA standards. It was a masterpiece. The next day, Linda, the new acting president, came by for an inspection. She stood on the sidewalk with her clipboard, because apparently clipboards are mandatory for anyone associated with an HOA, and stared at my yard like she couldn't decide whether to be impressed or annoyed. This is very elaborate," she said finally. "Thank you," I replied with a smile so wide it probably made her uncomfortable. "I just wanted to make sure everything was up to standard." Linda muttered something about needing to consult with the rest of the board before walking off in a huff. And that's when I knew Karen wasn't going to let this go. Sure enough, 2 days later, another letter arrived, this time claiming that my garden gnomes were excessive and violated HOA guidelines regarding decorative elements. The letter demanded that I remove all but 3 gnomes within 7 days or face yet another fine. Now, at this point, most people would have thrown their hands up and said, "Fine, take your stupid gnomes." But not me. Oh no, this wasn't about gnomes anymore, this was war. So instead of removing them, I doubled down. I added more gnomes, hundreds more, and expanded the tableau into what could only be described as Gnometopia. There were gnome firefighters putting out a tiny gnome fire, gnome construction workers building a miniature house, and even a gnome marching band complete with tiny instruments. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood about my escalating feud with Karen, because let's be honest, everyone knew Linda was just her puppet. People started stopping by to take pictures of Gnometopia and leaving notes of encouragement in my mailbox. One neighbor even dropped off homemade cookies with a note that said, "Keep fighting the good fight." Karen must have been losing her mind because 2 days later, Linda showed up on my doorstep again. this time with 2 other board members in tow. "Mr. Monroe," she began in what I assume was supposed to be an authoritative tone, but came off more like someone trying not to cry at work. "The board has decided that your lawn decorations are creating a distraction for other residents." "A distraction?" I asked innocently. "How so?" "Well," Linda stammered, clearly unprepared for follow-up questions. "We've received complaints about traffic congestion." Traffic congestion. As if people stopping their cars to admire Gnomtopia was somehow my fault. "Interesting," I said thoughtfully. "Do you have those complaints in writing? Because according to state law, and yes, I'd done my homework, any enforcement action taken by an HOA must be supported by documented evidence." Linda blinked at me like she'd just realized she'd wandered into enemy territory without backup. "I'll have to get back to you on that," she mumbled before scurrying off with her clipboard brigade. And just like that, Gnomtopia stayed exactly where it was. Over the next few weeks, Karen tried every trick in the book to get me to back down. More letters threatening fines, which Frank promptly challenged, surprise inspections, which always ended with Linda looking increasingly defeated, and even an anonymous complaint about noise pollution from my sprinkler system. Seriously. But no matter what she threw at me, I refused to budge. And eventually, she gave up. By the time spring rolled around, Gnomtopia had become something of a local landmark. People from neighboring communities started driving by just to see it for themselves. Kids loved it. Parents thought it was hilarious. Even Jordan admitted it was kinda cool. And as for Karen, well, let's just say she stopped showing her face around the neighborhood entirely. Not because anyone forced her out, but because she couldn't stand being reminded that sometimes bullies don't win. You'd think Gnomtopia would be the grand finale, the moment where Karen finally admitted defeat and slunk off into HOA obscurity. But no, Karen wasn't just a sore loser. She was a sore loser with too much time on her hands and an unhealthy obsession with control. And while she may have stopped showing her face around the neighborhood, she hadn't stopped scheming. I found out about her latest plot one sunny Saturday morning when Linda, yes, Linda, her loyal sidekick, showed up at my door with yet another letter. By this point, I developed a Pavlovian response to yellow envelopes. Mild annoyance followed by a deep, inexplicable craving for coffee. I opened the letter and skimmed through it while Linda stood awkwardly on my porch, clutching her clipboard like it was a shield. The letter informed me that the HOA was proposing new rules to preserve community harmony. Among these rules, a ban on excessive lawn decorations, a restriction on non-standard landscaping features, and, my personal favorite, a clause requiring all homeowners to submit their yard designs for approval before making any changes. I stared at Linda for a moment, waiting for her to crack a smile or say, "Just kidding." But no, she was serious. "This is ridiculous," I said finally, holding up the letter like it was evidence in a trial. "You're telling me I need permission to plant flowers in my own yard?" "Well," Linda began hesitantly, "it's not about flowers. It's about maintaining a cohesive aesthetic." "A cohesive aesthetic?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Linda, half the houses in this neighborhood have plastic flamingos in their yards." Linda shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about aesthetics or harmony or any of the other nonsense they'd written in that letter. This was about Karen trying to regain control through her puppet HOA board. Now, I could have just ignored the proposal and waited for it to die in committee like most HOA nonsense does. But where's the fun in that? If Karen wanted to play games, I was more than happy to play along. And win. The first thing I did was rally the neighborhood. Over the past few months, Gnomtopia had turned me into something of a local hero, so it wasn't hard to get people on board. I printed flyers explaining the proposed rules and how they would affect everyone, not just me, and distributed them door to door with Jordan's help. We even set up a website called Save Our Yards, where residents could sign a petition opposing the changes. Within days, the petition had hundreds of signatures, and people started showing up to HOA meetings en masse. The once empty conference room at the community center was now packed with homeowners who were fed up with Karen's antics and ready to fight back. At the next meeting, Linda tried to present the new rules as if they were some sort of groundbreaking solution to all our problems. She stood at the front of the room, reading from her clipboard while Karen sat in the back pretending she wasn't pulling all the strings. By implementing these guidelines, Linda said in her best attempt at sounding authoritative, we can ensure that our community remains beautiful and welcoming for everyone. Define beautiful, someone shouted from the crowd. Linda blinked nervously but kept going. These rules will help us prevent distractions caused by excessive decorations or unconventional landscaping. Like what? Another voice called out. Gnomes? Flamingos? What's next? Christmas lights. The room erupted into laughter and murmurs of agreement. Linda looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, holding up a copy of the proposed rules like it was Exhibit A in a courtroom drama. These guidelines aren't about preserving harmony. They're about preserving Karen's ego. There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd. For years, I continued, gesturing toward Karen without actually naming her, because subtlety is key. Certain individuals have used this HOA as their personal fiefdom, issuing fines for shiny mailboxes, unauthorized ferns, and yes, gnomes. More laughter. But enough is enough, I said firmly. This neighborhood belongs to all of us. Not just a select few who think they can dictate how we live our lives. By the time I finished speaking, people were clapping and cheering like we were at some sort of suburban revolution rally. Linda tried to regain control of the meeting but eventually gave up and adjourned early. Over the next few weeks, things escalated even further. Karen started sending anonymous letters accusing me of inciting unrest and claiming that my lawn decorations were attracting undesirable attention from outside visitors. One neighbor told me she saw Karen sneaking around my yard late at night with a flashlight, probably trying to find something else to complain about. But no matter what she did, it didn't work. The petition continued gaining signatures. Residents kept showing up to meetings, and eventually even Linda started distancing herself from Karen's schemes. And then came the final blow. An independent audit of HOA finances revealed even more instances of Karen misusing funds during her tenure as president, including payments for personal legal fees related to her defamation lawsuit against me. When word got out about this latest scandal, Karen lost whatever support she had left, and frankly, whatever dignity too. By the time summer rolled around, Karen had officially resigned from all HOA activities and put her house on the market. Rumor has it she moved to Florida, probably because there are fewer HOAs there willing to tolerate her nonsense. As for me, well, Gnometopia is still standing strong. In fact, it's become something of a local landmark. People from neighboring communities come by just to see it for themselves. And every time someone stops their car to take pictures or leaves a note saying how much they love it, I can't help but smile. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about gnomes or lawns or even Karen. It was about standing up for what's right and reminding everyone that sometimes bullies don't win. So Karen was gone. Her house sold, her clipboard retired, her reign of HOA terror officially over. You'd think that would be the end of it, the final chapter in a saga of petty grievances, gnome warfare, and suburban rebellion. But no, because Karen's departure didn't just leave a power vacuum. It left a legacy, and that legacy was chaos. With Karen out of the picture, the HOA board was in shambles. Linda quit shortly after Karen moved away, probably because she realized she couldn't wield power without Karen whispering instructions in her ear. The remaining board members were either too overwhelmed or too apathetic to do anything productive, which meant the HOA essentially stopped functioning altogether. First, this was great. No more surprise inspections. No more passive-aggressive letters about mailbox shine or lawn height. No more fines for unauthorized flora. For a brief, glorious moment, it felt like we'd achieved true freedom. A utopia where homeowners could live their lives without fear of clipboard-wielding tyrants. But then came the downside, absolute anarchy. Without anyone enforcing the rules or even pretending to enforce them, things started to spiral out of control. One neighbor decided to paint his house neon orange because, apparently, he'd always wanted to live inside a traffic cone. Another family turned their front yard into a makeshift junkyard, complete with broken appliances and a rusted-out car that hadn't moved since the Clinton administration. And then there was the guy who installed a 20-foot inflatable dinosaur on his lawn for the kids. Now, I'm all for entertaining children, but when you have a T-Rex looming over your neighborhood like it's auditioning for Jurassic Park, it's hard not to feel like things have gone off the rails. First, I tried to ignore it. After all, I wasn't about to become the new Karen, not after everything we'd been through. But as the chaos grew worse, people started coming to me for help. "David," one neighbor said as she stood on my porch holding a plate of cookies, because apparently baked goods are the currency of suburban diplomacy, "you've got to do something about this." "Why me?" I asked, genuinely baffled. "Well," she said with a shrug, "you're the one who took down Karen. You're basically our leader now." "Our leader?" I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry, but as more and more people came to me with their complaints about noise pollution, unsightly decorations, and that one guy who kept hosting backyard wrestling matches, I realized something. They weren't wrong. Like it or not, I was the de facto leader of this neighborhood rebellion. And if I didn't step up and do something, no one else would. So I did what any rational person would do. I ran for HOA president. Now, let me be clear. I didn't want to be HOA president. If anything, I wanted less responsibility in my life, not more. But sometimes you've got to take one for the team, and this team desperately needed someone who wasn't going to find them for shiny mailboxes or call the cops on teenagers sitting on benches. My campaign was simple. No nonsense, no tyranny, and absolutely no clipboards. I promised transparency, fairness, and an end to ridiculous rules that served no purpose other than making people miserable. And because everyone in the neighborhood already knew me and knew what I stood for, I won by a landslide. My first act as president? Dismantling half the HOA rules Karen had put in place over the years. Out went the restrictions on lawn decorations. Yes, Gunomtopia stayed. Out went the fines for minor infractions like trash cans left out past pickup time or grass growing half an inch too tall. Out went the mandatory approval process for yard designs because seriously, who has time for that? Instead of focusing on nitpicky nonsense, I shifted our priorities to things that actually mattered. Maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and making sure everyone felt like they had a voice in how our neighborhood was run. And you know what? It worked. Within months, things started turning around. People stopped painting their houses neon orange and started planting flowers instead. The junkyard family cleaned up their yard, partly because we offered free disposal services and partly because they finally realized how bad it looked. Even the inflatable dinosaur guy scaled back his decorations, though he did keep one smaller dinosaur as a compromise. As for me, well, being HOA president turned out to be less terrible than I expected. Sure, there were still occasional headaches, like mediating disputes over parking spaces or dealing with that one neighbor who kept trying to turn his garage into a nightclub. But overall, it felt good knowing I was making a difference. And every time someone thanked me for standing up to Karen or told me how much they appreciated having an HOA that actually cared about its residents instead of controlling them, well, it made all the drama worth it. But here's the thing. This story isn't just about me or Karen or even Gunomtopia. Though let's be honest, that part was pretty great. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it feels like you're fighting an uphill battle against someone with way too much power and way too little common sense. Because at the end of the day, bullies don't win, not if we refuse to let them. So if you've ever dealt with your own version of Karen, whether it's an overzealous HOA president or just someone who thinks they can dictate your life, remember this: you're stronger than you think. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say enough to inspire others to do the same. Oh, and if you ever need advice on how to handle lawn decoration disputes, hit me up. I'm basically an expert now. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. If you enjoyed this story, or if you've got your own HOA horror story, drop a comment below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more ridiculous tales from suburban life.